Thanks for coming out. I recognize quite a few faces here, several faces from Twitter or whatever other speakers or from other sessions. Access control models. This is a topic that perhaps you interact with a lot, perhaps maybe you don't realize you're interacting with this topic. Hopefully we shed some light here, get some deeper understanding of what an access control model is, identify what you're using, and define it out. As I mentioned, I'm also a subject matter expert for ISE squared. If you ever take this CSSLP or SSMP, I've probably reviewed, written, or authored, kicked out other questions there on those exams. They're most famous for the CISSP. I'm local here, regular communication user group meeting. If you are local, don't go to those, I encourage you to go. They're good meetings, a good group that shows up. So these are the kind of the broad topics we're going to be delving into. We've got access control flow. We're going to get a structure out what we're going to be talking about. Define out some specific terminology is very applicable. We'll cover the four main access control models. There's others, but these are the primary ones. Discuss the pros and cons, discuss the implementation considerations. I think we take into consideration where companies. So the basic flow is you have a subject, you authenticate them, request access to resource, and then authorize that specific request. Authentication is going to be that first thing. It's you as a user or as an entity, it's basically something you know, something you own, something you are. So the know is going to be your classical password. Something you own, maybe it's a key card with a token, an RC token or something. Something you are is going to be like a biometric, retinal scanner, thing like that. It's to verify that you are who you actually say you are, rather than you're not who you are. It's a way to verify the identity. The subject, when we're talking about the subject, is going to be, again, it's usually often it's a person, or it could be a non-person entity. Maybe it's a cron job running, or a service bus of some sort, or an automated system running. It's whoever's going to make that request to the resource. The next step, that data flow, requesting that resource. The resource, also known as an object, anything that's protected from unauthorized use. It could fall into quite a few different categories. Often you're going to see data in there. You don't want your databases public, and those would be the most common. It might be some functionality. Maybe you have some trade secrets functionality, maybe you have some hardware you want to have access to. So it can fall, there's quite a few things that can fall into those classifications. Again, data is going to be the most common there, and functionality behind it. I work for a drug testing company, and some of our data reports, we don't want people seeing the drug test results unless it's been released to the customer, unless it's been released to specific people. And then functionality, we'd have custom random generation for random drug testing pools, and so that would be functionality that we keep as a secret or trade secret. Any questions so far about authentication or about subject resources? This can be very important to defining out the access control models. The access control models come into play when we get down to the authorizing the request. The authorization is going to say who's allowed to do what. Who's allowed to access the resource, maybe use a resource, perform actions on that resource. The authorization is going to be use your CRUD, create, read, update, delete. And that's where the access control model is going to be sitting, the logic behind that. That's going to define out what exactly is going to happen. It dictates who gets to do what. It's a very short description of an access control model. You have the subject, they're going to want to get access to a resource, the access control model is going to be making that decision. So the four Who is using DAC? Anybody know? Who's using Mac? RBAC? ABAC? Who doesn't know? Be honest. Okay. That's fine. There's some bleed over in a couple of these. We'll get into where that might be. Hopefully by the end you'll be able to clearly answer and know what you want or what you're currently using. And perhaps if you want to move to a different access control model, you know exactly what you want to go to. These are very well to find out. There's lots of papers written, there's lots of research done. These are the 4 that are by far the most popular. There's others I mentioned, there's others out there, but these are the 4 that generally you're going to see, we're going to be using already. So discretionary, mandatory, role-based, probably role-based is the most popular, and attribute-based is going to be one of the newer ones that's getting a lot of traction. So discretionary, let's see you have a house, a car. I've got my house keys here. I'm the owner of my house. I decide who gets the key to my house. It's up to me. I decide you get the key or you don't. So discretionary, the owner of the resource, it's up to their discretion who gets access to it. Pretty simple. Another example is your email. You log into your email account and you decide who you're going to email. You decide who's going to get that message. You can give away your password to other people if you want, but generally you won't. In that sense, you are, that's a discretionary access control model, so even. Files on the system, if you are the owner of that system, you're going to be, you can share those files with others. It's up to you. You have complete control of that. You can throw them up on a public server, you can share them, you can keep them secret, whatever you want to do. Very simple, it's the most simple access control model. You have a subject and you grant access to a resource. That subject is based on their subject identity, going back to the authentication. The subject has to be authenticated, we're going to assume that. Most common implementation you see is an access control list, where you have this subject gets this resource, this subject gets that resource, and so on. A simple example table, what it might look like if you have Alice and Bob. You know, Alice wants to access to reports, you can allow that, but deny finance. And Bob, you're allowed reporting, but deny finance. It's the most simple. You know, it's pretty easy. From a development standpoint, very simple. Very little effort required, generally speaking. If you're going to generate a SQL statement, you use PO or whatever, that might be an example of what it might look like. Really easy. Very straightforward. It's got a high operational overhead. As a system, if you keep taking care of the system, you got to keep track of all the resources, all the subjects, and you've got to hope that the owners are giving correct access to the resources.
You've got to potentially update code every time somebody adds or joins your queue.
Yes. Yep. Yep. It's very high operational overhead. You have to maintain that. You have to keep track of all that. It's not ideal for most systems. That if you work in development, it's probably not ideal. But it's available. And in small situations, it might be. If you have a small system with only a couple of users and a few resources, sure. Might be easy enough at that point. But it's not very scalable. Any questions about discretionary? We'll go a little bit later into actually implementation and comparison between models, but anything specific about discretionary. So mandatory. This is going to be the one that you think of the military, you're going to hit mandatory. Classified documents. You have to have top secret clearance in order to access documents. You can read down and write up that philosophy. Military intelligence would be another example where you have to have, and if you only have low-level access, you can't see anything that's above you. You can only see at your level and down. A blog, if you're the author of a blog, you have access to that. You can read, someone who adds a comment, they can't change the blog. They have more access than you. That's a straight up. classification level. Maybe if you're into gaming, nobody here I'm sure is into gaming at all. Maybe you have a level 40 character to do a specific way. You know, and you can't do anything higher than that until you reach that level. Maybe if you're working for a search engine, you know, only specific levels are have clearance to be able to change the algorithms. Google, of course, is going to keep it very high secret. They're going to have specific requirements. You can't access it until you reach a certain point. So here's a diagram of what that might look like, where you have the subject, the resources, and the subjects are assigned by this system to a specific classification. The resources are assigned to a specific classification, and then wherever those match up is where you can access. It's focused on object sensitivity. The focus is on keeping sensitive information private. It's focused on the subject security level and the clearance. What needs to be set. So the owner, it's important to remember that the owner sets the object label and the system sets up the system level. So if the owner that can't go and give access to a specific subject, that's not allowed in a straight mandatory access control system model. That is defined separately. Where in discretionary, the owner has complete access. They can give resource access to whatever user. In mandatory, that's not the case. Any questions about mandatory? Feel free to ask any questions as we go along. At the end, if we have enough time, we'll get into more discussion. Here's an example of what, if you were to chart it out. This is what it might look like. So the top secret can see top secret, secret, and confidential. Where confidential is going to be the confidential is going to get denied. So the example here, if Alice, Bob, is it Claire? I can't think of. Oops. Claire, I couldn't think of it if it was Alice, Bob. I always hear Alice, Bob. I can't remember what's after. So you define out the security level for the subjects. The labels are assigned to the objects, so it would be resources, and wherever you match up. So maybe you assign number 1 is top secret, number 2 is secret, 3 is confidential, and so on. This is the easiest way to implement that. Again, just plug these into the chart there. The simple, if you generate a SQL statement to kind of express that, the key there would be less than or equal to. So as long as they're at that level, you can give access to them. Provides for multi-level security. It's going to be much more minimal than a mandatory, than a discretionary. It's less overhead. It's still not great, but it's better. There's no flexibility. You can't make exceptions to the rule with a pure mandatory access control law. That's not allowed. I think it's moderate overhead. Not bad. Role-based. Who's using role-based? I think imagine it's probably the most popular. Classic example, Amazon Prime. As a customer, you can buy stuff. If you have a role of Amazon Prime user, you get the free 2-day shipping. Access of a role. Roles on a computer, you can have different roles that you can assign to specific users. You can have one or many roles. You can have administrators, maybe you have a development group, maybe you have a system administration group, maybe it's sales, marketing, whatever. You can be one or many of those groups. Medical staff, you go walk into the hospital, the doctor's going to be able to help you with a few things. Surgeon, maybe some in the front office, they're going to have different roles that they're going to play. If you walk into the emergency room, you'll be helped by a nurse or a doctor, one or the other. And anyone fitting those roles will be able to help you. Whereas someone in the accounting may not be able to help you. Maybe someone's going marketing. You have different roles you got to play. Or if you're playing multiplayer games, if everybody does the same thing, you don't win. You have different roles they have to go and fulfill. Maybe you have the sniper, maybe you have Here's again the flow chart, what that may look like. You have the subjects, the resources, and the subjects are one of any assigned to roles, and the resources are the roles assigned to the resource. And if you are assigned to a role that has access to the resource, you get access to it. Pretty simple. Again, there's no exceptions to the rules. There's ways around it, but in a pure role-based access control model, there's no exceptions. So the subject, again, is assigned to that role. It's important to remember that. And the role is granted access to the resource, not the other way around. So, getting into the tables again, there are examples here. Alice is in accounting and orders, Bob's in payrolls, Claire's in orders and reporting. The roles are assigned out, so this role gets this resource, this role gets this resource, and so on. And so as long as Alice is in accounting and accounting has finance, then she gets the finance resource. If you were to script it out in a SQL statement, find out something like that. The subjects, the resources, the roles mixed together. This is posted up. You can go check out the one action sequence examples. Some big caveats with role-based is that you have role explosion. Anyone have to deal with role explosion? So this is where let's say you have different offices around the country. You have to go make a different role for each person at a different office because they want to do something special. This person, oh, I really need to be able to access this. It's like, well, you're not in that. Your role's not allowed permission to that. So you have to go make a whole new role, assign that one person to the role, and then they have access to that resource. And then, next day someone else comes up and they want access to do something special or that nobody else can do. Or maybe it's a couple people. So you get this situation where you start getting role explosions, where you have role after role after role having to be created. This is where role-based can get ugly and harder to maintain. I see some smiles, but I'll deal with this in turn. Toxic combinations, of course. Let's say someone is in the accounting department and they want to get access to auditing. So you're not going to have that. Or they're auditing, but they're money in, money out. And the access to control that as well. Toxic combinations have to be watched out for. So those are some of the caveats. Generally, the role-based is going to be used very commonly. It's going to be able to achieve what you need to do. It's got that lower overhead, far more scalable than discretionary. It's arguably more scalable than mandatory, depending on how mandatory is rolled out. Any questions about role-based as the most popular? Most people have actually either used it or are involved in it. It's something they do on a daily basis.
I have a question. When you have a role-based, can you implement the first one, the one that
Discretionary?
Discretionary, the one that the owner can actually give access to, let's say, a research. So let's say you have an application that is role-based, but then you have like these boxes or baskets that each user has, and they have files that can be uploaded there. To allow the user to give access to another user to their file that you just uploaded for whatever reason. Could I implement a different system just to allow the user to say, allow this other user to have access to this? Would that have any kind of conflict or whatever?
In a pure role-based, you'd have to set up a new role for each of those scenarios.
Okay.
Where the user, if you want to have user X wants to grant user their subject Y access to the resource. Discretionary though is going to be what they're wanting, so you can mix and mingle those two a little bit, and that's the situation. But that's going to be something that's going to be usable. Once the system's set up that way.
So can I implement both in the same system?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So
Yeah. So all these access control models can technically be implemented together. Often you don't want to, but you can. if the reason comes up, the purpose comes up, if it's a separate system, those kinds of situations. So you can mix and mingle them, but it's not a pure implementation at that point.
Just understanding like your terms, so when you talk about roles, is that including the permissions side of it, roles and permissions, or is that the next step that you're going into?
So the roles is going to be, the permissions you're referring to is the,
Not the permissions that fall within a role.
yeah, so you'd have the authorization to a specific resource, that would be permission.
Mm-hmm.
So you see the example is Alice has authorization to accounting, and because she's in the accounting role, perhaps.
Right.
So that'd be the permission you set up, based on that resource in that role. Any other questions? So attribute based. Who's using role based? Who's using attribute based but doesn't know it? This is probably pretty more common than you think. But before it wasn't clear. It wasn't clear that it was separate. As we get into it, you may realize that you're already using attribute based. Maybe you're not. The classic example is a key card system. You have the key card, you walk up to the building, swipe your card, it lets you in or you don't get in. Attribute based comes into play is if you walk into that building at 2 o'clock in the morning, you get denied. You show up again at 8 o'clock and it lets you in. The attribute there is the time. The environment's changed. Another situation might be, if you want to get to a specific room in the building, maybe it's not going to let you in unless an administrator swipes their card first, or it's a certain time of the day, those kinds of situations. So the attribute based, maybe a card monitor. Just last week, my card got again fraudulently used. I don't know what it is. They keep giving me the same number, a different expiration. So your credit card monitoring, it's going to go and just look for those anomalies. So it's got those attributes that it's checking. Sure, you can use it. You can use your card and purchase something in the United States, but as soon as that location changes to, you're purchasing something bulk out of Russia, it's going to get flagged. It's an attribute that's going to be keyed off of that. Airport security. Who went through airport security recently? I'm local, so I didn't. But if you came out here, if you fly from this is like a classic example of attribute based. You have to have, you have to be either going on a flight or be accompanying a child on a flight. And you can't have your liquids with you, or they have to be in a bag. Those different attributes that have to be met in order to get through the security line. Maybe your attribute is that you are, you go through pre-check. You pre-screen, so you can go through with keeping your shoes on and that kind of stuff. All these different attributes come into play to get through the security line.
If you don't have the attribute of a pilot, you can skip it.
Exactly. And walk right up to the front, skip it. So there's all those different attributes that come into play with the airport security check. It's probably the easiest example to see where attributes come into play. And another good example is you can't go through security if your flight's more than X number of hours away. You can't show up 4 days ahead and get through. I haven't tried it, but that's my understanding. As good as Master Chief is, he's not going to be able to go to the vault of glass because he's a Spartan. He's not, a Destiny character there. If you've played Destiny, then more. He's not legendary. Conditional authorization is based on those attributes. It was defined out as an attempt to unify the models. Each model we've talked about has its benefit and its pros and cons. The attribute based attempt to unify those. It's not perfect, but it does a pretty good job. It's composed of 4 different areas. The first one is the subject. So that's going to be, as we talked about earlier, whoever's requesting access. The action, this is where you can define out, they have access, it's like with the role-based, they could get access to accounting, but maybe all of accounting. Or this, you can go say, they can have access to read accounting, but not write to accounting. So you can filter it out based on the attribute. The resource, again, as we talked about, the resource always there. the environment. This is where we get to the time of the day, maybe the location, maybe it's the operating system they're on. You know, if they're coming in on Explorer 10, which is finally dead, right? Use my access to it. It actually becomes complete. So the bigger table here, another example of what it might look like. Behavior manager, but this would have a data entry. The data entry can create records at any hour in region A, but not after hours for region B. Maybe, you know, you don't want to work at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, or on the weekends maybe. That'd be great. The ability to filter these out, define these out a little bit more strict. So the subject again is who they are, maybe the roles that you assign to them. It's important to know that you can have roles still with this. So you can go and say Alice and Bob are in these specific roles. That's going to be a big part of that. Or who they're affiliated with. You know, maybe they're the Utah department or headquarters or whatever. And the clearance level, you can even have their clearance levels in there. So you can mix and mingle a lot of those different concepts. Maybe you have the concept of an administrator or non-administrator or account manager or whatever.
This is really common in the LDAP world, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's attributes.
This is one that you probably are using, but you don't realize it.
Yeah.
Helpful for APIs. You got post, get, put, delete, execute commands. Resource, again, we talked about if it's the data, functionality, execution of things, resources, hardware. And the environment. Again, this is going to be things like the time, the network. Maybe you have a way to determine securely if they're actually the VPN. Or maybe they're authenticated a different way. Operating system, encryption method, you know, if they're using an old encryption method, if they're on an old browser, if they're on whatever else. If they're on Windows XP, you can keep them off. Gartner predicts 70% of all businesses will rely on ABAC by 2020. That's important to keep eyes on this. ABAC was really defined out about 5 years ago. Before then it was talked about, but wasn't fully understood. It's important to note there's an attempt to standardize it. It became proprietary, so that it's not really used, but it's important to know. It's called XACML. There's an attempt to standardize the terminology and everything in XML format, define like your policies in specific ways. With ABAC, the concept that may not be fully implemented is that the logic needs to be centralized in policies. That's where you may not be fully implemented or may not have full ABAC, is if that logic's separated or dispersed out in an application, where ABAC's going to try to bring that together into one spot. It's far more refined access. You can go and say who can do what specifically without having the problem of role explosion. You know, without having to say, you know, if someone doesn't have the clearance level, we bump them up a clearance level. You know, you get the problem with that if it's not supposed to be like that. You can there's ways to work around those. You know. It's designed to meet the needs. You know, as the systems become more advanced, it's got more data to control. Again, access for API control is more to find out. Any questions about ABAC?
So it seems like, I think you had a table of like the example, and it kind of reminded me of like the ACL, where it was like very granular. So it seems like, would that have a lot of operational overhead to do that?
Depends on how it's implemented. So not all situations need to have everything to find out. You know, you need to be able to have access to the system all hours of the day. The environment may not really matter most times. That's going to be the case most of the time. Most of the time, the roles are going to be sufficient. But there are going to be scenarios, you know, where it's going to be the environment's going to come into play, or other attributes to be considered. Any other questions?
Just on this next section.
Implementation. How do you implement it, right? Consideration. So this is development, if you can read that from back there. Development versus operational considerations. From a development standpoint, discretionary and mandatory are pretty easy. It's probably going to be your simplest to implement. It's going to be easiest to develop. If you can write unit tests up against it, it's going to be the easiest test week. Pretty easy, generally speaking. Architecturally, actual lines of code is going to be smaller. There's going to be frameworks that plugins or have it built in already. Operationally, discretion-oriented can be a mess, especially as you get lots of users. I think about our systems, we have thousands of users right now. It would be a nightmare to have to operationally keep track of those one by one. Mandatory is going to be better. It's not great, but it's definitely a step better to have the clearance levels, classifications considered. Role-based, it's got the yellow. It's going to be better long-term than the other two, generally speaking, but depending on your systems, specifics could be different. But it's going to have, you have to have more thought into your architecture. You're not just going to roll it out simply, overnight. It's going to take some more thought, more planning to get it accurately done or correctly done. And operationally, it's going to be generally the easiest to implement operationally because your users are generally going to understand role-based more. It's going to be generally easy for them to know what's going on. Attribute-based is going to be the hardest to implement. It's going to take the most thought, the most architecture. It's going to have somewhat of a higher operational overhead, just because you have the other attributes that can be taken into account. You have to be able to make sure you implement it correctly so that it's not overly complex. It's important to have good documentation. You don't want to have the documentation obscured out. You want to make sure that's clear what each attribute is and be able to find that out. That's a pretty big operational consideration. But again, you can just use, most things will be at just the low level, which will be a lot easier for most of these situations. But then we get to the benefits of each one. So discretionary, scalability is terrible. It's fine if you have a small system, few users, few resources. It may be the best because you don't have a lot to worry about. It may be the easiest. And I've heard, I've seen various situations where it wasn't the best choice. That's perfectly fine. Granularity is questionable. You can't specify out, the environment or any other attributes of that. Sensitivity is very bad because it relies on your owners of the resources correctly assigning out the authenticator authorization. It doesn't take too much for user A, subject A to go and send an email or talk to them or say, hey, I want access to the thing when I'm not really supposed to, and the owner giving in and giving me access. So sensitivity-wise, it's an important consideration. Mandatory is going to be far more scalable, and it's pretty simple. If you look at the levels, you assign the levels to the subject and to the resource, you're done, scalability-wise. But it's not very granular. There's no exceptions to the rule. If you want someone to be able to read a specific document, you have to up their classification or declassify the document, right? Which, it's going to be, once you declassify it, everybody else is going to read it. If you bump them up, they're going to read everything else you're not supposed to see. So there's no way around it. So granularity is not great, but it's really good for sensitivity if done right. That's what the military generally uses it for their army systems. Role-based scalability. As mentioned, we talked about the toxic combinations and role explosions. That's where the scalability is going to become a problem, especially if you have users that need exceptions to the rule, if you have specific access to things. But it gets a green light in granularity and sensitivity. It's going to be a lot better than mandatory granularity, but it's not quite as good as attribute-based. Sensitivity is pretty good because you're assigning roles rather than the discretion of the owner. And attribute-based, well, remember in the previous slide, attribute-based was the hardest to develop and the highest operational. it's gonna have the most benefits long-term for an application, generally speaking. Again, there's exceptions to the rules, but generally speaking, it's gonna give you the most flexibility. It's gonna be easiest to use long-term, be able to provide access to it. So who's using ABAC? I didn't know. Again, there's so many different use cases, there's so many different applications out there that it may be different needs of where you need to use each of these. And maybe I'm one using attribute-based, another one using discretionary, another one's mandatory. Each system might be different. That's an important consideration when you're choosing access control model to use. The sensitivity of the resources that are going to be used, if it's got high sensitivity needs, you may want to consider mandatory instead of attribute-based or role-based. So just keep that in mind. The scalability of the model, consider how many resources and how many subjects you have. That's going to make a big impact. And think long-term as well. And not just think about the here and now. Think about, 5 years, 10 years, where is this going to be at? If it's going to have a large number of users, you may want to consider something other than discretionary. But if you know it's going to be limited to just a few users, go discretionary. Think about the granularity requirements. Again, going back to the TSA, the airport security check, how granular do you have to be? What attributes do you have to be able to check? Is that an important consideration, or are there no exceptions to the rules? Existing frameworks and projects. One caveat with attribute-based is not a lot of frameworks are going to have a lot of plugins or code support. They might not. Whereas role-based or mandatory or discretionary access control laws might have more implementations built into frameworks. So that is an important consideration. Or if you're working with APIs, if there's external interfaces, if you don't care if the API needs to know anything about the environment it's coming from, maybe the attribute-based isn't needed, it's overkill. You always take care of it.
Seems like attribute-based would be really good as the parent system where multiple things plug into to get their authentication from, because it can do roles, it can do attributes, and it can do security roles.
Right.
So it's just good. How do you implement access or attribute-based in SQL though? Is that a slide on here?
No, it's not a slide here because there's so many different ways to do it.
Okay.
Generally, you're going to be following the role-based, so that same SQL statement would be used or something like that. The attribute-based is where it gets a little tricky.
Yeah.
Because some of it's going to be SQL or database, some of it's not. Some of it might be, you might be checking.
Okay. Yeah.
There's all sorts of different things you have to check in, so there's no one golden or silver bullet on it.
Okay. That's what I'll do.
Yeah. So we use, in most of the systems we're using ABAC. Where the roles are centralized. The attribute-based is a lot harder to keep those attributes and logics centralized because it comes in from different scenarios. Do we allow this user to do this? Well, it depends. Are they internal, are they external? Are they authenticate a specific way? Or are they using this? Use it for protocols, whatever. Any other questions? Another situation we get into is we have a lot of integrations. In the drug testing world, there's a lot of soap integrations. We're still using soap stuff. So we have a lot of soap integrations, a lot of labs that hold school systems.
Yeah.
So we have different considerations there. They're sending sensitive information over soap, and it comes in all hours of the night. So we can't consider that. But we make sure that they have specific authentication or specific encryption. Algorithms are being used to make sure they're using specific technologies and not using really old, bad stuff. Those are considerations. As a general overview, so you have, as we get into the information storage, increasing access control challenges over time. So this is going to be the older stuff, DAC was first, and mandatory, role-based, followed by attribute-based. So over time, as systems become more complex, you have different models that have been developed and used. Role-based for a long time has been the predominantary. It still is. I would foresee it being a main one for a long time. Attribute-based, is definitely picking up speed, picking up ground, being used a lot more and being identified more. That perhaps is one of probably the hardest part is identifying it correctly. Again, discretionary is just going to be really simple. If you don't have to have all the extra roles, if you don't have to have sensitivity, it's a small system, that discretionary might just be the best answer. It's going to be more sensitive information if you're getting into personal identification information. If you're getting into social, if you're storing socials, if you're not having to do that, if you're getting into anything else where it's sensitive information and mandatory, maybe better route. In the role-based, you're probably using role-based to an extent, or maybe using attribute-based. Important with the AVAX, the policy-driven, being able to find out these policies, be able to have that documentation to know exactly what's going on. I've seen situations where that wasn't documented, it becomes a problem because we don't know, the system's not documented well enough. If that's the case, there's questions come up, a feature change, oh, this isn't right because of that. Really, it was, specific attributes that we set correctly for sure. So that's probably the hardest part about the attribute-based is bringing those policies into one place. Again, when you're implementing it, consider the operational overhead. Who's going to be using the system? Who are the administrators? Are they able to understand and use the system? What are the authorization needs? You look at the data, maybe do an analysis of what you have. How complex is it? How sensitive is it? Consider what you're currently doing. Think about what you're doing with your current applications. Consider where you want to get to, where it's going, and see if there's anything that needs to get changed. Any questions? Access control laws?
So I think in the project that I'm working on, we're using roles, we're also using kind of attributes. And this particular application had like some really specific, you're this type of role, this type of whatever, this type of whatever. And so some of these rules, of what you can see, were quite complex and they didn't all fit within one nice SQL query. So we created a bunch of policies, which were just classes that had methods that said, okay, you can do this, can you do an update? And it would, an update on a particular resource, and it would go through and do all the checks, whatever they were, the roles, but other attributes as well. And that all worked really awesome, having all those policy classes, what we call them, in one place, because you could just go, they were almost like documentation, because you could just pull up any policy to read through what someone could do or could not do. However, what we ran into was that when it came to like more like view sort of stuff, if someone could view, when we were doing like large database queries to find resources that user could use, maybe for a search, maybe a user searching for other users, what we ran into is that those policies were almost impossible to recreate in an SQL query. So that made it really, really difficult because we couldn't do like paging and stuff like that. You have to, select the entire data set and then run through the policies to basically to reduce down the set to what that user could actually see.
Right.
You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah. So
what we ended up doing in certain situations, we did just that. We just grabbed the whole data set and then reduced it down, but there was memory issues there, obviously.
Right.
But then the flip side, in some instances, we actually tried to create that SQL, like all those rules in the SQL query, which had obvious performance benefits, but was a real difficult thing to do. I was just wondering if you have any tips around an easier way to do that, or is that basically the choices I have?
We've run into the same problem. We've gone on some of the same architecture. We're having specific methods to identify specific policies. So each attribute would have a specific class, and then policies have a class, and there's attributes and methods calls to figure out the attributes. Yeah. That's the route we've gone. Building up the complex SQL statements can be difficult. We've found that the best way for us to implement it is to centralize it as much as we can. So there's something we find that's being repeated, we're going to abstract that out and reference that instead of trying to redo that. And that's been the biggest benefit we've seen, but it's still getting some of the complex items. Sometimes some developers hate store procedures,
Yeah, yeah.
But sometimes we find that's the best way to abstract that out, if it comes down to actual data crunching.
That's assuming that the database knows everything it needs to know, though.
Yes, or it can be passed in.
Yeah, that's true.
So that is something we also run into. We generally avoid the scope procedures for that kind of stuff, but we found a few situations where that has been the answer, or a function, or whatever else we use.
We use scopes a lot for that too. All right, so there is no perfect.
No, the important thing is, it's initially, you're trying to keep policies in one spot. And that's the biggest challenge, is keeping them in one spot, being able to reference them rather than having dispersed throughout your system. It was a nightmare at that point.
Yeah, and that was a really nice change. It was just the SQL stuff is, well, we felt it was hard to keep it there because SQL queries end up in lots of different places.
Yeah, that abstraction is the biggest challenge, or biggest solution that we found, is just to abstract it out wherever possible, to keep that so you only have to do that check once, or create that check once.
Yeah.
And there are situations where we haven't been able to put everything in one query. We have to break it out to multiple queries. And some people don't like to have it do that, but sometimes you gotta do it.
Yeah.
Good question. Any other comments or questions? So what are you guys using? You said most people are using role-based. What are some of the challenges you found with role-based, or what are you looking for in the system?
Yeah, I've seen the explosion problem. It's
Explosion problem?
the list of roles just grows exponentially, and certainly it grows quite wide.
Right.
So,
What have you found has been best to address this role-based?
So I work for the LDS Church. We use LDAP. We've got over 1 million users in the system, and it's the only thing that I've seen that everything can tie into it. So we had to support LDAP and web service calls to do authentication, but between the two of those, it's pretty solid.
Right. Okay. That's good. We found another situation we've run into with role explosion is sometimes user training as well. So you understand how the roles should be created versus how they are being created. That has been a big benefit we've seen in just the user training. Often that's overlooked, but that has been something we've seen has been huge for making sure that the roles don't get used or abused the way they should be. Any other challenges you guys have had with access control roles?
Definitely seen the small scale apps that do the direct, and it's a big fat pain.
Yes. Overhead on was just on this question.
So one of the issues that we're actually working through right now is how to handle, so we work at Brigham Young University, and we have to handle faculty members who retire or leave, or student employees that only work there for a semester, trying to handle, how do we figure out if they leave, and how do we do expiration dates per role, or per, working through how to control that access, because our roles are being assigned and taken away all the time. We just need to figure out a better process for that.
Right, keeping able to maintain the roles is, and so is that something you're considering? Maybe like the attributes would be, the attributes maybe they're active or inactive, or
Yeah, and that is actually something that's come up. Like, how can we check with the university what their status is? Because we work for just a college within the university. So far we're just working on it, but it's still one of those issues that comes up when we've got a fluctuating user base.
definitely see that. We have users that occasionally check their system. So the example in the drug testing world is they often do quarterly random drug testing tools. And so you have users that are only logging in at once a quarter, but their passwords expire every 30 days. So that's the problem we've run into. So we've had to have different ways to flag those so we can help the user easier be able to get the application while keeping their password secure and keeping that rotation going. So that's being an example too, where the attributes can come into play and help out.
One thing we've also had to do, I work
for Brigham Young University as well. We're in the business school, and we've discovered that some of our roles are essentially the same, need to be able to do the same actions, but with different sets of data. So for example, the secretary of the accounting department and the secretary of the MBA department would do the same things, but one of them only needs access to the MBA students, the other one needs the accounting students.
Right.
So we've had to kind of create roles and then like sub-roles within that. So have like, department secretary role and then a sub-role underneath that that is for accounting versus MBA.
Right, because we don't just have broad access to accounting, it's specific.
Right, because otherwise we have to create, we have to essentially create redundant roles.
Right. So there's a concept of a hierarchical role where, the accounting would be the role, and then the accounting within a specific college would be the sub-role of that, where you can deny access or allow access to based on the parent of the child. That gets into some, we didn't really delve into that here, but that is a concept that is out there used. Any other questions about our time? But good discussion. Again, this is kind of an area where perhaps maybe coming into it, you didn't understand fully. As I was researching this, I didn't really fully understand it. I feel like it's so commonly used. It's something that every developer has to address, and the better we understand it, the better we can address it, and come up with a viable solution. Thanks everyone for attending. Please read it on join me. If you joined in, give me feedback. If anything I can do better on this presentation, please let me know. Those are for feedback. Thank you.